Good morning, afternoon, or good night, everybody. Welcome back to another lesson for 8th grade U.S. history, covering Chapter 13, the Civil War. Lesson 4, finally getting to the end of the greatest war, well, most bloody, most important, most significant war in U.S. history. So without much ado, let's go back and review some of those short answer questions from last week. So describe the battles of Manassas and Antietam. Why are they significant? So at Manassas, the Confederates drove back the Union, right? It demonstrated to the South that they could handle the North, maybe made them a little overconfident, and ultimately caused them to spread themselves too thin, right? It was the first major battle, and it showed the North that they're going to have to actually compete in this. And then on the flip side, at Antietam, George B. McClellan manages to beat Robert E. Lee. However, he does not chase him down and ultimately kill him or capture him, and that leads to McClellan being fired. So the first major battle, and then ultimately the opportunity to end the war, but McClellan drops the ball. 7, what was the Emancipation Proclamation? Right, it was a declaration stating that all slaves in the rebelling states of the Confederacy were henceforth free. So it didn't have a lot of effect on those border states, but it did make the war about slavery. So that's part of the reason that Lincoln issued it. It also forced the French, the Spanish, the English, really the rest of the world, to kind of separate themselves from the South, because now it was a war about slavery. So it kind of forces the South to lose some of their potential allies. The significance of the Battle of Gettysburg, right? The bloodiest battle of the Civil War, and it was a turning point. After that point, Robert E. Lee never really goes on the offensive. And then question 9, what's the significance of the Battle of Vicksburg? So after the siege at Vicksburg, Ulysses S. Grant is made the general-in-chief of the Union Army, and it's the culmination of Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan. We have successfully bisected the South along the Mississippi, thus making the war for them infinitely more difficult. All right, so jumping back into it, Chapter 13, Lesson 4, the end of the war. So let's talk about how this war starts kind of wrapping up, right? The path to victory and the role of diversity in the war. So Grant takes command of all of the Union forces after having made a name for himself at the Battle of Vicksburg. His goal is going to be this total destruction of all Southern forces. He wants to wage total war, right? No mercy, victory or death. And so his methodology is to destroy the Southern economy, right? If they don't have food on the table, if they can't make money, then this war will have to grind to a halt. Simultaneously, he knows that he can send this gentleman, William Tecumseh Sherman, General William T. Sherman, to Georgia to just run amok, to cause havoc. So he sends Sherman to Georgia, and Sherman begins what will be known as the March to the Sea. So Sherman marches from Atlanta, Georgia to Savannah, which is on the coast. So from central Georgia to coastal Georgia. And on the way, he destroys railroads, cuts telegraph lines, burns down farms, businesses, everything that he can't keep and use and take with him, he burns down. The dude is a boogeyman, right? The South is fearing for their lives. They don't know where he's going to strike next. And so a lot of people start leaving the front lines to go and defend their homes from Sherman. And he's literally just burning a swath through Georgia from Atlanta to Savannah. So he doesn't have a lot of supplies. He's living off of what he can get, either from the land or from things and places that he has captured. And ultimately in South Carolina, simultaneously, you have the Fort Wagner assault. It's one of the first times that the Union used African-American soldiers in battle. And one of those African-American soldiers is pictured here on the right-hand side of your screen, and that is William Carney. He's an African-American soldier, and he was the first to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. And if I'm not mistaken, I'd have to go back and check. That was posthumously. That means he didn't get it while he was alive, because racism, of course, still alive and well, right? They want to end slavery, doesn't mean they like black people or treat them as equals. And then at Fort Fisher in North Carolina, we have another non-white individual. You have Philip Bazar, born in Chile. He's the first Hispanic American to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. Again, I think also posthumously after he died. So either of those gentlemen can show up on the STAR test. All right, Lincoln now is up for re-election in 1864, and so he is a controversial figure, right? As a result of the draft riots, as a result of the war going on much longer than anybody expected. The wars are deadly, they are expensive, And so it's not a given that he's going to win this election. He was unsure, right? The morale for the war is low. A lot of presidents leading up to him had only been one-term presidents. James Buchanan, one term, I think. Pierce before him, one term. Fillmore, one term, and a slew of presidents before them as well. And then the Emancipation Proclamation had made him further more unpopular because those border states now that are part of the Union but have slaves are kind of wary that if the war ends, he's going to take their slaves as well. And we'll talk about it at the very end of this chapter, that is the goal with the 13th Amendment. So he's up against his former general, George B. McClellan, the former general of the Union Army. This dude, super popular. Americans love war heroes. And he almost clinches this election. But thanks to a bunch of recent victories, Gettysburg being one of them, Vicksburg being another, Lincoln is popular enough that he wins the election of 1864. And in his second inaugural address, he says, look, the goal is no longer to preserve the Union, because they know that they're going to win the war at this point. It is to end slavery. He still wants to preserve the Union and bring the South back in, but it is a war about slavery. On the top right-hand corner of our screen, we see a quote from him in his second inaugural address, and there we see a photo on the bottom right as well. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in. The work we are in being reuniting the Union and, of course, ending slavery. So let's talk about the end of the war. So, late 1864, most Confederate soldiers, not most, a lot of Confederate soldiers have started going home to protect their families. They have seen the writing on the wall. They know the war is going to come to an end, so they start kind of slowly disappearing from the front lines and going back to their homes to kind of defend themselves from people like Sherman and from other northern attacks, right? They're more concerned with protecting their property and their families and their livelihoods than they are with the grand ideals of the Confederacy as a whole. And then April 1865, the Union finally takes Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, thus heralding the end of the war. And ultimately, Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant at a place called Appomattox Courthouse outside of Richmond, Virginia. One of the more interesting facts about this is that the officers and soldiers of the Confederacy that surrendered were pardoned. Not all of them, but most of them, a lot of them, they were pardoned, meaning they were allowed to go home. I think I have it here. Yeah, I don't. A lot of them were allowed to take their horses with them. And so the goal was to minimize the animosity between the North and the South. They really wanted to put this war behind them as quickly as possible and get back to the antebellum status quo. So the new goal now for Lincoln and for Congress and for really everybody in the United States is to figure out, how do we solve the problem of post-war America, right? How are we going to bring the Confederate States back into the Union? How are we going to deal with the lingering issue of slavery, which at that point is BT dubs over. They've just passed the 13th Amendment, and we'll kind of come back to that. But yeah, slavery is ended at that point. So they've ended slavery, and we'll come back and hit that, but they've also ended the war. And so now they've got a lot of questions they've got to answer. And Lincoln was going to be the one to kind of guide them through that until he gets shot in the head by John Wilkes Booth, literally within like 2 weeks. I think it's like a week and a half of the war. Within weeks, right, April 14th and 15th, Lincoln gets assassinated, shot in the back of the head by John Wilkes Booth, who's a famous actor. He sneaks into this theater while Lincoln's essentially on a double date with his wife and one of his generals or somebody. They're watching a play called, I think it's My American Cousin or Our American Cousin. Booth sneaks in, right? He's a celebrity. It's like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson asking to meet Donald Trump. He goes in, pulls a gun, shoots Lincoln in the back of the head, jumps off of the balcony into the seats below, escapes from the theater. I think he stabs a policeman on the way out, gets on a horse, rides off, and is on the lam for a couple of weeks, and eventually gets caught. And he's in a barn. They light the barn on fire to get him to come out, and they pump him full of lead. So they don't have any idea behind the motivations and stuff other than the notes and things that he left behind and correspondence. Lincoln survives for a few hours, but ultimately, he's been shot in the head. He dies. And so had Lincoln survived, though, had this not happened, had he not been assassinated, BT, it was the first, right, presidential assassination at this point. We've had presidents die in office, but nobody's been assassinated. And so had Lincoln survived, though, the upcoming period of Reconstruction, of rebuilding the South and bringing them back into the fold, would have been very different because Lincoln wanted to be super lenient with the South. He said, look, I want to put this all behind us. I want to treat the South relatively well so that we don't have anything like this going forward. However, Lincoln is out, and this allows a group within Congress known as the Radical Republicans, right? These very, very progressive Republicans to seize control of Congress, and their goals are to punish the South for the atrocities of the war and to provide and protect for all these recently freed African Americans. They want to fix the problems of the pre-war period and make sure that these African Americans, these black people in the South, are taken care of as best they can. And that's really going to be the focus of the next chapter on Reconstruction. So very quickly, we can review all the big major battles that you need to know potentially for the STAR test from this chapter. So Manassas and Bull Run, you need to know the Confederacy won. The big name for that battle, Stonewall Jackson. And it showed that the North had to take the South seriously. Next battle, you got Antietam/Sharpsburg. The Union wins. You need to know General George B. McClellan. This win gives Lincoln the edge he needs, the confidence to pass the Emancipation Proclamation. You've got a Union victory at Gettysburg. You don't really need to know any names from that one, but it's the bloodiest battle, last 3 days, 50,000 casualties. Vicksburg happening almost simultaneously, right? They wrap up around the same time. Big name for that is Ulysses S. Grant. It allows them to split the Confederacy, and it ends up with Grant becoming the commander-in-chief of the Union forces. And then finally, the battle at Richmond/Appomattox. The Union wins. Grant and Lee meet. Lee surrenders to Grant, and the war is over. So very, very quickly, because we're going to come back to the 13th Amendment in the next chapter, but right at the tail end of the war, in April, I want to say it's April, I'd have to go back and double check my notes, but right at the tail end, they introduce and ultimately pass the 13th Amendment that says that all slaves are free. We have the text here, right? Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction, and that Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation, meaning they can enforce this through whatever means they need to. Gets passed by the Senate April 8th, 1864, and the House January 31st, 1865. So really like months before the end of the war. I want to draw your attention very quickly to section 1 and just go off on a tangent here. So slavery nor involuntary servitude can be used as a punishment for a crime unless they've been duly convicted, meaning that you can be made a slave or an involuntary servant if a judge and jury says that's your punishment. They can do that, just a heads up. Okay, so let's jump into this quiz. We got question 1. How did President Lincoln succeed in permanently abolishing the practice represented by the tree in this cartoon? So the tree is labeled slavery. You've got, it looks like a kid up in the tree. It says Lincoln's last warning. Now, if you don't come down, I'll cut the tree from under you. And so I think that's supposed to be Jefferson and Davis up in the tree. So how did Lincoln permanently abolish the practice here? Take a moment, think about it. What ends slavery? Is it F, by ordering the use of popular sovereignty to decide the issue of slavery? G, by encouraging an armed rebellion of slaves in the South? H, by promoting the passage and ratification of the 13th Amendment? Or J, by helping abolitionists fund the Underground Railroad? Oops, sorry. Didn't mean to make that pop up. Hopefully you're aware that it is H, 13th Amendment. Question 2. What was the result of the events shown on the map above? So we've got Richmond and Petersburg and Appomattox Courthouse. So why is Richmond and Appomattox important? Is it F, General Lee's troops received necessary reinforcements? Was it G, General Grant's supply lines were completely cut off? H, General Lee surrendered to General Grant? Or J, General Grant and General Lee combined forces? Yeah, definitely not that one. Hopefully you know that the answer is, take a moment, H, right? Lee surrenders. Question 3. After Robert E. Lee surrendered Appomattox Courthouse, the main priority of the United States was to do what? Was it F, elect a new president and vice president? G, complete construction of the Capitol? H, establish Union forts in the former Confederate states? Or J, implement a plan to bring Confederate states back into the Union? Take a moment, pause the video if you need to, and hopefully you came to the right answer, which is J, right? They want to bring the states back in. Question 4. Many historians argue that the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln changed the course of Reconstruction. Which of the following is usually cited as an aspect of that change? Was it F, that radical Republicans took control of Congress? G, Congress imposed taxes on cotton imports to pay war debts? H, the 13th Amendment was approved by Congress? Or J, Congress repealed legislation regulating railroad construction? Right? What happens after Lincoln's assassinated? F is the correct answer. And the last question, I believe, where did the events shown in this painting occur? So we've got Thomas Nast's interpretation of Robert E. Lee's surrender to General Ulysses S. Grant, ending the war. So you got Grant on the left, Lee on the right. Where does this all happen? Was it A, a private home in Appomattox County, Virginia? B, the U.S. Capitol building? C, a public church near Ford's Theater, where Lincoln was assassinated? Or D, the governor's mansion in Richmond, Virginia? Take a moment. Hopefully you know the answer is A. And then for bonus points, if you're interested, you can write me a little essay to practice your essay writing skills addressing the following prompt. I want you to explain how Lincoln's position on slavery changed from his candidacy to the end of the war. Make sure you mention his inaugural addresses, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the 13th Amendment. What was his true opinion of slavery based on the evidence we have seen? And what was his opinion of African Americans in general? And with that, I'll leave you for today. Oh, there's a Jeopardy link at the end of the slides if you're interested in playing some Jeopardy with your friends, right? History Jeopardy is the best. But it's been fun. It's been real. It's been real fun. I've been Bennett. You've been awesome. And I'll see you in the next video.